This presentation will be on the famous photographer of Roger Fenton, also known as the originator of war photography. So for his life story, Fenton lived from 1819 to 1869. He was born in the small area of Haywood, England, and growing up he studied painting and law in both London and Paris. And he was also the founder of the Royal Photographic Society in London. So he's very into photography, and he was eventually appointed as the official photographer of the Crimean War. So, as for his legacy and what he's left behind for other photographers, he's best known for his Crimean War photos. He, of course, founded the Royal Photographic Society in London, and he was the first photographer to photograph the British monarchy, Russia, and the Kremlin. He's also responsible for some of the first biased media because he only portrayed certain parts of the war that glorified one side. So he was very biased, and it was printed in Illustrated London News. For his artistic style, he used now antiquated materials and ways of photography like the wet collodion process. And the wet collodion process, you add a soluble iodide to a solution of collodion and coating a glass plate with the mixture. And he specialized in landscapes and still lifes, and he reported obviously with his photos, and he utilized vantage point and lighting as his main rules of composition. This is his first photo called The Valley of the Shadow of Death. It's a landscape, and as for the composition rules, he used vantage point and depth. As you can see, it goes very far back, and he's located pretty close to the ground. The first thing I saw whenever I looked at this were the cannonballs scattered all over the ground. At first, they don't really look like cannonballs, they just look like rocks. But since I know that it's about war and he was photographing the Crimean War, I know that they're cannonballs and there's so many of them. So that's kind of shocking. So in reaction to this, I was shocked, and it really makes you feel empty and quiet and kind of lonely. You can tell there's no life. And then for his next photo, it's I'm not really sure how to pronounce this, Sebastopol from the front of the Cathcart's Hill. And this is also a landscape. And for his rules, he used the rule of thirds because you can see the men in the picture aren't centered. And he also used lines, as you can see the horizon, and depth because you can see the hills in the background as well as the foreground. As for my first observations, I noticed the movement of the men as one man has his arm up, and also the debris all over the ground. So I feel like there was definitely something happening here, maybe a conflict. And this makes you feel very like lost and helpless because you can see that there was a lot of destruction, and there's three men like in this wilderness, and it makes you feel kind of sad. This next photo is very famous of his. It's the Cornet Henry John Wilkin, and this is a portrait, and he used depth and rule of thirds. As you can see, he's not really centered. He's kind of off to the left. And I noticed the English Army uniform that he's wearing, and it just makes you feel, you can tell that his posture, he's very confident. You feel like he's in control, he has authority, and you can tell that he's a general or some high position. This is two officers of the 47th Regiment. This is a documentary photo, or I'm not sure if that's exactly what you would call it, but he definitely was documenting the war. And for composition, you can see the symmetry of the two horses and the men on the side. And you can also see depth with the man standing in the left background. I noticed their uniforms, their horses, and how they're in the desert here. And it also made me react as if he had authority. As you can see, the man in the middle is of higher ranking than the others based on his uniform. And he's standing in the middle of the photo rather than on either of the sides. So it kind of makes you feel inferior, or like the men on either side are inferior. And again, it just photographs the war. This is railway officials, and it's very candid, and it's also a documentary photo. You can see the framing of the doorway and the two men in the center. You can also see the texture and pattern of the roof as well as all their different clothing. They're all wearing different types of clothing. And I noticed that it looks very impoverished in this area because of the cracking of the building and the sidewalk and everything. But I really reacted. It looks very casual. The men are in all different poses. They look as if he just came up and photographed people and they didn't even know he was there. But it also portrays hardship because you can tell that they are not very affluent and the building is very dilapidated. This last photo is called the Sanitary Commission, and this is a still life portrait. And you can see the lines that he uses on the left and also on the floorboards, and also the rule of thirds because they're not centered either of the men. The first thing I saw originally were their jackets because I feel like they really stand out with the patterns and their clothing and their facial hair. So what, because that was kind of the style back then. It shows that it's an older picture. And then I noticed the cannonball on the right lower side of the picture. And that shows how they were in war. And this photo makes me feel very posed because you can tell the men know that the photo is being taken. It also portrays war because of the cannonball. I feel like they're planning for war. And it kind of portrays expectations because I feel like they're posing in a way that they would expect. They know that people are watching. And yep, that is the end of the presentation. Roger Fenton took all of these photos, and as you can tell, he was very into documenting war and history and all of that.